The moment Bradley Blackwell burst through my office door that Tuesday morning, I knew everything I had worked for was about to pay off. His designer shoes clicked against the marble floor of the Meridian Tower as he strode toward my desk with the arrogance only money and privilege can breed. "Clean out your desk. This building belongs to my father now," he announced, waving legal documents like victory flags. The smirk on his 25-year-old face told me he expected me to crumble to beg to grovel for mercy. Instead, I calmly reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a deed that would change everything. "Actually, your father's lease expired Tuesday," I replied with a smile that 7 years of planning had earned me. "You have 2 hours to vacate my property." 6 months earlier, I never could have imagined this moment would arrive. My name is Angelita Rodriguez, and for 7 years I had managed the Meridian Tower, a prestigious 40-story commercial building in downtown Phoenix. The building housed law firms, accounting offices, and medical practices that served the city's elite. Every morning I arrived at 6:30 to ensure the lobby gleamed, the elevators ran smoothly, and every tenant felt their rent was worth paying. Harrison Blackwell owned the building, and in all my years working for him, he had treated me with the respect and kindness my own grandfather never received from the business world. Harrison was 78 years old, a man who had built his real estate empire through honest dealings and fair partnerships. He remembered my birthday, asked about my college classes, and often stayed late to discuss building improvements over coffee in his penthouse office. Everything changed the day Marcus Blackwell returned from his 10-year stint living in European luxury. Harrison's only son had spent most of his adult life avoiding responsibility, using his trust fund to finance a lifestyle of expensive hotels and exclusive clubs. Marcus was 45, with the soft hands of someone who had never worked a real job, and the cold eyes of someone who viewed other people as obstacles to his comfort. He brought his son Bradley with him, a spoiled 25-year-old who had graduated from Stanford with a business degree and an attitude that the world owed him everything. Bradley wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly salary and spoke to service workers like they were furniture that occasionally made noise. The first red flag appeared during Marcus's second week back. I was reviewing vendor contracts when I overheard him on a phone call in Harrison's office. He was discussing medication schedules and doctor appointments with someone he kept calling Dr. Williams. The conversation made my stomach turn because Marcus was talking about adjusting Harrison's prescriptions without Harrison being present or even aware of the call. I started paying closer attention to the family dynamics. Marcus had convinced Harrison to let him handle more of the building's financial decisions, claiming he wanted to ease his father's workload during his golden years. Bradley spent his days lounging in the executive conference room, making loud phone calls about investment opportunities and real estate deals that sounded too aggressive for Harrison's conservative business style. The second red flag was the isolation. Marcus began intercepting Harrison's calls from old friends and business associates, telling them his father was too tired for visitors or too busy for social gatherings. I watched Harrison's confusion grow as his social calendar emptied and his daily routine became increasingly controlled by his son and grandson. But the moment I knew something criminal was happening came during my third week of careful observation. I was working late updating tenant files when I heard raised voices from Harrison's penthouse office. Marcus was shouting about legal guardianship papers and competency evaluations. Bradley was laughing about how easy it would be to convince a judge that his grandfather was losing his mental faculties. I quietly activated the recording app on my phone and moved closer to the partially open office door. What I heard next made my blood run cold. Marcus was explaining to Bradley how they could manipulate Harrison's medication to create symptoms of dementia and confusion. They planned to document these episodes, use them to petition for legal guardianship, and then sell the building along with Harrison's other properties before anyone could stop them. The conversation lasted 23 minutes, and I recorded every word. They discussed forged medical reports, bribed doctors, and a network of lawyers who specialized in elder abuse cases. Marcus had already identified buyers for the Meridian Tower, and Bradley was researching Harrison's other real estate holdings across Arizona and New Mexico. But the detail that shattered my heart was their casual discussion of what would happen to Harrison after they gained control of his assets. Bradley suggested a state-run nursing facility where his grandfather would be heavily medicated and isolated from anyone who might question his condition. Marcus agreed, adding that Harrison's death from natural causes would be convenient but not necessary for their plan to succeed. I realized that night that I was the only person in a position to protect Harrison from his own family. But I also knew that going to the police with a secret recording might not be enough to stop two wealthy men with expensive lawyers and connections throughout the city's legal system. As I sat in my car in the parking garage listening to the recording for the third time, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to fight back, but I needed a plan that would not only save Harrison, but also ensure that Marcus and Bradley faced real consequences for their cruelty. The next morning, I began the most important investigation of my life, knowing that failure would mean watching a good man be destroyed by the very family members who should have protected him. The truth about my connection to Harrison Blackwell was something I had kept hidden for 7 years, but it became the foundation of everything that followed. My grandfather, Samuel Rodriguez, had been Harrison's business partner in 1978 when they purchased their first commercial property together. They were young men with big dreams and a handshake agreement that they would split all profits equally as they built their real estate empire. For 5 years, Samuel and Harrison worked side by side, reinvesting every dollar they earned into new properties. My grandfather handled construction management while Harrison focused on financing and tenant relations. Together, they acquired 12 commercial buildings across Phoenix and Tucson, creating a portfolio worth millions of dollars by 1983. But success attracted the attention of Marcus Blackwell even as a teenager. When he turned 18, Marcus convinced his father that having a Mexican-American partner was bad for business with the wealthy white clients they were trying to attract. He argued that Samuel was holding Harrison back from joining the exclusive business clubs and social circles that could accelerate their growth. Harrison was weak in those days, more concerned with social acceptance than honoring his partnership with my grandfather. He bought out Samuel's share of the business for a fraction of its real value, using legal technicalities and contract language that Samuel could not afford to fight in court. My grandfather left the partnership with enough money to buy a small house, but he lost the empire he had helped build with his own hands. Samuel never recovered financially or emotionally from the betrayal. He worked construction jobs for the rest of his life, always telling me stories about the buildings he had helped create but no longer owned. When he died 8 years ago, his greatest regret was not being able to leave his family the security he had worked so hard to build. I took the job managing the Meridian Tower specifically because it was one of the original properties my grandfather had helped Harrison acquire. Every day I walked through lobbies and offices that contained my family's sweat and dreams. I was not seeking revenge, but I was determined to understand why Harrison had chosen social status over loyalty to the man who had been his closest friend. What I discovered over 7 years of working closely with Harrison was a man consumed by guilt and regret. He often spoke about Samuel sharing memories of their partnership and expressing shame about how it had ended. Harrison had spent decades trying to find my grandfather to make amends, but Samuel had changed his name and moved several times to avoid the humiliation of his business failure. Harrison never knew that Angelita Rodriguez was actually Angelita Samuel Rodriguez, the granddaughter of the partner he had betrayed 47 years earlier. I chose to reveal my identity gradually, sharing stories about my family that made Harrison's eyes fill with recognition and remorse. By year 3 of my employment, he understood exactly who I was. Though we never directly discussed the connection, that understanding led to the most important conversation of my life. One evening in December, Harrison asked me to stay after work to discuss something personal. He had been researching my family for months, he explained, trying to find a way to address the injustice his younger self had committed. Harrison had calculated the value of Samuel's lost partnership share, including decades of appreciation and profits. The amount was staggering enough to change my family's circumstances forever. But Harrison's research had uncovered something else. Marcus had been stealing money from the family business for 20 years. Bank records showed consistent transfers to overseas accounts, falsified expense reports, and property sales that never appeared on official company books. Marcus had been systematically looting his father's empire while living in European luxury. Harrison had secretly hired private investigators and forensic accountants to document Marcus's theft. The evidence filled 3 large binders that Harrison kept locked in a safe behind the painting in his penthouse office. But confronting Marcus directly would have been dangerous, given his son's willingness to use manipulation and fraud to achieve his goals. Instead, Harrison proposed something extraordinary. He wanted to change his will to leave the Meridian Tower to me as partial restitution for what my grandfather had lost. The building's current value was approximately $38 million, which represented a significant portion of what Samuel's partnership share would have been worth if the original agreement had been honored. But the plan required perfect timing. Harrison needed to gather enough evidence to ensure that Marcus faced criminal charges for his theft while also protecting the will change from legal challenges. We agreed that I would continue managing the building while secretly documenting any criminal activity I observed. Harrison would work with his lawyers to create an ironclad inheritance structure that Marcus could not contest. For 6 months, I thought our plan was moving smoothly toward success. Harrison seemed healthy and sharp. Our evidence against Marcus was growing stronger, and the will had been legally updated with multiple witnesses and notarizations. I believed we had months or even years to perfect our strategy. Then I noticed the changes in Harrison's behavior, and I realized that Marcus and Bradley had accelerated their own timeline. Harrison was becoming forgetful during our meetings, sometimes struggling to complete sentences or remember details we had discussed the day before. His hands shook when he signed documents, and he often seemed confused about basic building operations that he had overseen for decades. I suspected medication tampering, but I needed proof. I convinced Harrison to let me accompany him to his next doctor's appointment, claiming that I wanted to understand his health needs better for emergency purposes. What I discovered at that appointment made me realize that Marcus and Bradley were not just planning to steal Harrison's money, they were planning to destroy his mind in the process. Dr. Williams, the physician Marcus had been consulting, was not Harrison's regular doctor. Harrison's actual physician, Dr. Patricia Chen, had been treating him for 15 years and knew his medical history intimately. But Marcus had convinced Harrison to switch doctors, claiming that Dr. Williams was a specialist in geriatric care who could better address his father's aging concerns. Dr. Williams was prescribing medications that had no legitimate medical purpose for Harrison's actual health conditions. The drug combinations were designed to create symptoms that would mimic early-stage dementia, making Harrison appear confused and mentally unstable to anyone who observed him. The medication schedule required precise timing to be effective, which explained Marcus's phone calls about prescription management. I realized that Harrison's mental decline was completely artificial, the result of a deliberate poisoning designed to support a legal guardianship petition. But I also knew that proving medication tampering would be nearly impossible without access to blood tests and medical records that Marcus controlled through his influence over Dr. Williams. That night, I made the most difficult decision of my life. I could not save Harrison through conventional legal channels because the system was already compromised by Marcus's money and connections. If I wanted to protect the man who was trying to make amends for my grandfather's treatment, I needed to disappear Harrison completely before Marcus could complete his plan to destroy him. The solution I proposed to Harrison was so radical that it took 3 hours of discussion before he agreed to consider it. We were going to fake his death. Faking Harrison Blackwell's death required a conspiracy that would have sounded impossible if I had not spent weeks researching exactly how such a plan could work. The key was Harrison's friendship with Robert Martinez, a man who had been his college roommate 56 years earlier and now owned Martinez Family Funeral Services, the most respected funeral home in Phoenix. Robert and Harrison had maintained their friendship through decades of holiday dinners and weekend golf games. More importantly, Robert had built his funeral business on a foundation of absolute discretion and genuine compassion for families facing difficult circumstances. When Harrison explained our situation, Robert's response was immediate and unwavering support. Robert had been secretly helping abuse victims disappear from dangerous family situations for 12 years. His funeral home served as a safe house network for elderly people whose adult children were stealing their assets or threatening their safety. The operation involved a carefully selected group of doctors, lawyers, and social workers who understood that sometimes the legal system could not protect vulnerable people from their own relatives. Dr. Patricia Chen, Harrison's original physician, had been part of Robert's network since its beginning. She had witnessed too many cases where wealthy families used the guardianship system to control and exploit elderly relatives. When Harrison contacted her about our plan, she immediately began creating the medical documentation that would make his death appear completely legitimate. The plan required 3 months of preparation. Harrison gradually reduced his public appearances, citing health concerns and fatigue. Dr. Chen documented a progressive decline in his cardiovascular system, creating a medical history that would support a sudden heart attack as the cause of death. Robert prepared a funeral plan that would allow for a closed casket ceremony, eliminating the need for anyone to see Harrison's body. But the most crucial element was creating a safe location where Harrison could live while we gathered evidence against Marcus and Bradley. Robert's brother-in-law owned a ranch house 43 miles outside Phoenix, surrounded by enough land to ensure complete privacy. The house had been used as a safe haven for abuse victims for years, equipped with security systems and communication equipment that would allow Harrison to monitor his business interests while remaining hidden. During this preparation period, I continued working at the Meridian Tower, carefully documenting every illegal action I observed. Marcus had become increasingly bold about discussing his plans, apparently believing that his father's deteriorating mental state made discovery impossible. Bradley spent his days calling potential buyers for the building, describing it as an opportunity to acquire prime real estate from a distressed seller. I recorded dozens of conversations where Marcus and Bradley discussed bribing court officials, forging medical reports, and intimidating Harrison's longtime friends into supporting their guardianship petition. They had identified a judge who had previously ruled in favor of wealthy families seeking control of elderly relatives' assets. They had also located 3 doctors who were willing to testify that Harrison was mentally incompetent without conducting thorough examinations. But the recordings also revealed the true scope of their criminal enterprise. Marcus and Bradley were not working alone. They were part of a network that had successfully taken control of elderly people's assets in 6 other cases over the past 3 years. Their method was refined and systematic. Identify wealthy elderly people with limited family support, manipulate their medications to create symptoms of mental decline, petition for guardianship through corrupt legal channels, and then liquidate all assets before anyone could investigate. The network included 2 other sons who had used identical tactics against their own fathers, a daughter who had successfully placed her mother in a locked facility after stealing her real estate empire, and a nephew who had convinced a judge that his uncle's Alzheimer's disease justified selling 12 commercial properties. The total value of stolen assets exceeded $200 million, and none of the victims had ever been able to recover their property or prosecute their attackers. Harrison's case was intended to be their largest score, but it was also their most dangerous target. Harrison's wealth and social connections meant that his sudden death would attract more attention than their previous victims had received. Marcus and Bradley needed to control the narrative carefully to avoid suspicion from Harrison's business associates and longtime friends. Their solution was to accelerate Harrison's apparent mental decline through increased medication dosages, followed by a very public guardianship hearing where Harrison would appear confused and unable to manage his affairs. Once they gained legal control, they would gradually liquidate his assets, while keeping him heavily sedated in a private facility. The plan would take approximately 18 months to complete, by which time Harrison would either die from the medication overdoses or be so mentally damaged that he could never testify against them. The timeline meant that Harrison's fake death needed to occur before the guardianship hearing, which was scheduled for the first week of March. We chose February 28th as the date when Harrison Blackwell would officially die of a heart attack in his penthouse office. Dr. Chen spent the week before Harrison's death adjusting his medical records to show increasing cardiovascular stress. She documented chest pains, irregular heartbeat, and shortness of breath that would make a sudden cardiac event seem inevitable. Robert prepared the death certificate and cremation paperwork that would prevent anyone from demanding an autopsy or viewing the body. On the morning of February 28th, I arrived at the Meridian Tower at my usual time and followed our rehearsed plan perfectly. I called 911 at 8:47 a.m., reporting that I had found Harrison unconscious in his office. The paramedics who responded were part of Robert's network trained to recognize situations where vulnerable people needed to disappear for their own protection. Harrison was declared dead at 9:23 a.m. His body was transported to Martinez Family Funeral Services, where Robert conducted a private preparation ceremony that allowed Harrison to slip away to the ranch house while a weighted casket was prepared for burial. The death certificate listed cardiovascular failure as the cause, and cremation was scheduled for the following week. Marcus and Bradley's reaction to the news was exactly what we had expected. They expressed appropriate grief for public consumption, but I overheard them celebrating in private phone calls to their criminal associates. Harrison's death eliminated the need for a guardianship hearing and gave them immediate access to his assets through the will they believed was still in effect. What they did not know was that Harrison had changed his will 6 weeks before his fake death, leaving the Meridian Tower to me and distributing his other properties among legitimate charities and his longtime employees. The new will had been witnessed by 5 people and notarized by 3 different officials, making it legally unbreakable, regardless of any challenges Marcus might file. But the most important element of our trap was still being set. While Harrison was hiding at the ranch house, I was working with federal authorities to build a case against the entire criminal network that Marcus and Bradley had joined. The FBI had been investigating elder abuse cases across Arizona for 2 years, and our evidence provided the missing connections they needed to understand the full scope of the conspiracy. Special Agent Maria Santos had been assigned to the case after 3 families filed complaints about suspicious guardianship proceedings involving their elderly relatives. The complaints had not resulted in criminal charges because the legal system had already been compromised, but Agent Santos recognized patterns that suggested organized criminal activity. When I contacted Agent Santos with our recordings and documentation, she immediately understood that Harrison's case could provide the evidence needed to prosecute the entire network. The FBI began planning a comprehensive sting operation that would allow Marcus and Bradley to reveal their full criminal enterprise, while federal agents gathered irrefutable proof of their actions. The plan required Harrison to remain dead for several more weeks, while I continued working at the Meridian Tower, pretending to cooperate with Marcus and Bradley's efforts to take control of the building. I would encourage them to share details about their other criminal activities, creating opportunities for federal agents to document their admissions and gather evidence against their associates. But the most satisfying element of our trap was the knowledge that Marcus and Bradley would eventually face the same man they had tried to destroy. Harrison's dramatic return from the dead would not only expose their criminal enterprise, but also demonstrate that their victim had been smart enough to outmaneuver them completely. As I watched Marcus and Bradley celebrate their apparent victory over Harrison's estate, I knew that every day brought us closer to the moment when justice would finally be served. 3 weeks after Harrison's fake funeral, Marcus and Bradley had settled into the Meridian Tower like conquering generals dividing spoils of war. They had converted Harrison's penthouse office into their operational headquarters, complete with new furniture, expensive artwork, and a fully stocked bar that Bradley used for afternoon celebrations of their success. I continued my role as building manager, but now I was secretly working as an FBI informant wearing recording devices and documenting every conversation that revealed criminal activity. Special Agent Maria Santos had positioned surveillance equipment throughout the building, hidden in smoke detectors, picture frames, and office plants that allowed federal agents to monitor Marcus and Bradley's activities in real time. The break in the case came during Bradley's 4th week of occupation when he received a phone call that changed everything. I was delivering building maintenance reports when I heard Bradley's voice rising in anger from behind the closed office door. He was shouting at someone about timeline problems and unexpected complications that were threatening their entire operation. I quickly activated my recording device and positioned myself near the door, pretending to review paperwork, while Bradley's conversation revealed details that would ultimately destroy his father's criminal network. The call was from attorney Richard Steinberg, the corrupt lawyer who had been coordinating guardianship petitions for the elder abuse conspiracy. Steinberg was panicking because federal investigators had begun examining court records related to previous guardianship cases, looking for patterns that might indicate systematic fraud. Bradley's response was more revealing than he realized. He began listing specific details about their other victims, including names, property values, and dates when assets had been liquidated. He mentioned Martha Patterson, an 82-year-old woman whose son had successfully stolen her $4 million real estate portfolio. He discussed George Chen, a 79-year-old retired businessman whose daughter had placed him in a locked facility after taking control of his investment accounts worth $12 million. But the conversation that sealed their fate involved Bradley's admission that they had been systematically murdering their victims after stealing their assets. Martha Patterson had died from an insulin overdose administered by a nurse who was part of their network. George Chen had suffered a convenient fall down a staircase after his daughter gained access to his bank accounts. 3 other elderly victims had died from medication interactions that appeared accidental, but were actually carefully planned executions. As I listened to Bradley describe these murders with casual indifference, I realized that Harrison and I had uncovered something far more sinister than financial fraud. Marcus and Bradley were part of a network that was systematically killing elderly people for their inheritance money, using the legal system to legitimize their theft, and then eliminating witnesses who might eventually recover enough to testify against them. The recording of Bradley's phone call provided federal agents with enough evidence to arrest the entire conspiracy, but Agent Santos wanted to gather additional proof that would ensure successful prosecutions for all network members. The plan was to let Marcus and Bradley continue their activities for one more week, while FBI agents gathered evidence against their associates in other states. But our timeline accelerated dramatically when Marcus made a decision that revealed just how dangerous he had become. I was working late on a Thursday evening when I heard multiple vehicles arriving in the building's parking garage. Through my office window, I watched Marcus exit a black sedan with 3 men I had never seen before, all of whom carried themselves like professional criminals. I immediately contacted Agent Santos, who confirmed that federal surveillance teams had identified the 3 men as contract killers who had been linked to several suspicious deaths across Arizona and New Mexico. Marcus was not just planning to steal his father's assets. He was planning to eliminate anyone who might eventually challenge his inheritance claim or testify about his criminal activities. The revelation that my life was in immediate danger forced Agent Santos to accelerate the FBI operation. Federal agents had been planning to wait another week before making arrests, but Marcus's decision to hire killers meant that Harrison and I could not remain safe much longer. Agent Santos decided that Bradley's recorded confession provided sufficient evidence to justify immediate action against the entire network. But there was one final element of our plan that needed to be executed perfectly. Harrison's dramatic return from the dead had to occur at the precise moment when it would have maximum impact on Marcus's psychological state and provide the clearest evidence of the family's criminal intent. Agent Santos agreed that Harrison should appear during the confrontation that would result in Marcus and Bradley's arrest, creating an emotionally devastating revelation that would likely cause Marcus to confess everything on camera. The setup required careful coordination between multiple federal agencies. FBI agents would position themselves throughout the building on Friday morning, hidden in offices and stairwells, that would allow them to respond immediately when Marcus's criminal associates attempted to carry out their planned violence. Harrison would wait in a surveillance van outside the building, prepared to enter at the exact moment when his appearance would create maximum shock and confusion. My role was to trigger the confrontation by revealing to Marcus and Bradley that I knew about their criminal activities and intended to fight their attempts to steal Harrison's property. The conversation would be recorded by multiple federal agents, and any threats against my safety would provide additional evidence of their violent intentions. But the element that would make our trap absolutely devastating was the timing of Harrison's return. Agent Santos planned to have Harrison appear at the moment when Marcus was threatening to kill me, creating a psychological shock that would likely cause Marcus to admit his crimes while federal cameras captured every word. Friday morning arrived with the weight of 7 months of planning and 3 weeks of federal investigation. As I prepared for the most dangerous day of my life, I knew that the next few hours would determine whether justice would finally be served, or whether Marcus and Bradley would escape to continue murdering elderly people in other states. The confrontation began exactly as we had planned when Bradley stormed into my office at 9:15 a.m., demanding that I clean out my desk because the building now belonged to his father. His arrogant assumption that I would surrender without a fight was about to become the first step in his complete destruction. But what Bradley did not know was that his father Marcus was already in the building with 3 armed killers preparing to ensure that I would never be able to testify about anything I had witnessed. The moment I handed Bradley the deed showing that I owned the building, federal agents throughout the Meridian Tower began moving into position for the final phase of an operation that would expose one of the largest elder abuse conspiracies in American history. Bradley's face transformed from smugness to confusion to rage as he stared at the deed in his trembling hands. The legal document clearly showed that Angelita Rodriguez was the lawful owner of the Meridian Tower, with the property transfer having been completed and notarized 6 weeks before Harrison's supposed death. Bradley's expensive education had apparently not prepared him for the possibility that his victims might be smarter than he was. I watched him fumble with his phone, calling his father with increasing desperation as he tried to understand how their perfect plan had collapsed so completely. Marcus answered on the 3rd ring, his voice carrying the cold fury of a man who had spent 47 years believing that money and social status made him untouchable. The conversation between father and son provided federal agents with exactly the evidence they needed. Marcus immediately began shouting instructions about intimidating me into signing property transfer documents threatening to use whatever force was necessary to regain control of the building. Bradley's responses revealed specific details about their other criminal activities, including the locations where they had hidden stolen assets and the names of corrupt officials who had helped them manipulate legal proceedings. But the moment that sealed their fate came when Marcus arrived at the building with his 3 hired killers. I could hear their heavy footsteps echoing through the marble lobby as they rode the elevator to the 20th floor where my office was located. Bradley had unlocked the front entrance and disabled the building's security cameras, apparently believing that eliminating me would solve all their problems. Agent Santos spoke through my earpiece, confirming that federal agents were positioned on every floor of the building and ready to respond when Marcus revealed his intent to commit violence. The plan was to let him threaten me directly, creating irrefutable evidence of conspiracy to commit murder while ensuring that I remained safe throughout the confrontation. Marcus entered my office like a man who had never been told no in his entire life. His gray hair was perfectly styled, his suit was custom-tailored, and his gold watch probably cost more than most people earned in a year. But his eyes contained the kind of coldness that comes from viewing other human beings as obstacles to be removed rather than people deserving of basic respect. The 3 men with him were professionals who had clearly done this work many times before. They positioned themselves strategically around my office, blocking the exits and creating an atmosphere of menace that was designed to make me beg for mercy. But I had spent months preparing for this moment, and I was not going to give Marcus the satisfaction of seeing me afraid. Marcus began with what he probably considered a reasonable offer. He would pay me $500,000 to sign documents transferring ownership of the building back to his father's estate. The money would be deposited in my bank account immediately, and I could disappear to any city in America where I could live comfortably without ever having to work again. When I politely declined his offer, Marcus's facade of civility disappeared completely. He began shouting about ungrateful employees who did not understand their place in the world. He described the various ways that people who crossed his family had suffered consequences over the years. He mentioned specific details about Martha Patterson's insulin overdose and George Chen's fatal fall, apparently believing that threatening me with similar violence would convince me to cooperate. Bradley stood beside his father, nodding enthusiastically as Marcus described how they would make my death appear accidental. A slip down the stairwell, a gas leak in my apartment, a car accident on the freeway during rush hour traffic. They had refined their methods through years of practice, and they were confident that the police would never suspect foul play if they planned my murder carefully enough. But Marcus made one crucial mistake during his threats. He began bragging about how easy it had been to fool everyone with his father's fake death, explaining that Harrison was probably already cremated and scattered in some desert location where no one would ever find evidence of what had really happened. His casual description of murdering his own father provided federal agents with a recorded confession that would ensure life imprisonment regardless of any other charges. The moment when everything changed forever came when Agent Santos spoke a single word through my earpiece: now. That was the signal for Harrison to enter the building and begin walking toward my office, preparing to deliver the psychological shock that would complete our trap. I looked directly at Marcus and smiled with the confidence that comes from knowing that justice is finally about to be served. Actually, I said your father's death was completely fake, and he is about to walk through that door to watch you get arrested for trying to murder his business partner's granddaughter. The silence in my office was so complete that I could hear the elevator machinery humming as it carried Harrison toward our floor. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions that ranged from confusion to disbelief to the kind of terror that comes from realizing that your entire world is about to collapse. Bradley simply stood with his mouth open, apparently unable to process the information that his grandfather was still alive. The footsteps in the hallway grew louder as Harrison approached my office door. 78 years old, but walking with the strength and purpose of a man who had spent months preparing for this moment of absolute vindication. Behind him came 6 FBI agents, their weapons drawn, and their faces showing the satisfaction that comes from successfully completing a complex operation. Harrison entered my office wearing the same gray suit he had been buried in 3 weeks earlier. His face showed the health and mental clarity that came from being free of the medications Marcus had been using to poison him. But his eyes contained something I had never seen before, the cold fury of a man who had discovered that his own son was willing to murder him for money. Marcus tried to speak, but no words came out. Bradley actually stepped backward, bumping into one of the hired killers who was staring at Harrison like he was seeing a ghost return from the grave. The 3 criminals who had been hired to murder me suddenly realized that they were surrounded by federal agents and had been caught in an elaborate sting operation that had been planned for months. Harrison looked directly at his son and spoke with the voice of a man delivering a final judgment. "Marcus, you have spent your entire life believing that money could protect you from the consequences of your actions. Today, you discover that some things are more powerful than wealth, and justice is one of them." Agent Santos entered my office with her credentials displayed and began reciting the rights that Marcus Bradley and their 3 associates would need to understand before being transported to federal detention facilities. The charges included conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, fraud, extortion, and racketeering across multiple states. The evidence included hundreds of hours of recorded conversations, financial documents showing stolen assets, and testimony from federal agents who had witnessed their criminal activities. As federal agents placed handcuffs on Marcus and Bradley, I realized that the moment I had been working toward for 7 months had finally arrived. Harrison's plan to make amends for my grandfather's treatment had succeeded beyond anything we could have imagined. Not only would I inherit the building that represented my family's stolen legacy, but Marcus and Bradley would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison, unable to continue murdering elderly people for their inheritance money. The irony was perfect and complete. Marcus had tried to steal his father's empire by faking mental illness and planning murder, but his victims had outmaneuvered him by faking death and exposing his entire criminal network. The son who had spent 47 years believing that he was smarter than everyone around him had been defeated by an elderly man and a 28-year-old property manager who understood that patience and planning were more powerful than money and violence. As I watched Marcus and Bradley being led away in handcuffs, I knew that my grandfather's spirit was finally at peace. Samuel Rodriguez had lost his partnership 47 years ago because he trusted a weak man who chose social status over loyalty. But his granddaughter had reclaimed that legacy by helping a reformed man choose justice over family loyalty, creating a victory that would protect countless other elderly people from suffering the same fate. 3 months after Marcus and Bradley were sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, the Meridian Tower had been transformed into something that would have made my grandfather proud. I used Harrison's detailed business plans and my own vision for community development to convert the building from an exclusive commercial space into a hub that supported small businesses, nonprofit organizations, and professional services that served Phoenix's diverse population. The first floor now housed a legal aid clinic that provided free services to elderly people who suspected family members of financial abuse. The second and third floors contained office space for immigrant business owners who had been excluded from traditional commercial real estate because of language barriers or lack of credit history. The fourth floor had been converted into a community center where neighborhood organizations could hold meetings and events that brought people together across cultural and economic divisions. But the change that brought me the most satisfaction was the fifth floor, which now served as the headquarters for the Samuel Rodriguez Foundation for Elder Protection. Harrison had insisted on naming the foundation after my grandfather, explaining that Samuel's legacy should be honored through work that prevented other families from experiencing the betrayal and theft that had destroyed his partnership 47 years earlier. The foundation employed 12 full-time investigators who worked with law enforcement agencies across Arizona to identify and prosecute elder abuse cases. We had successfully helped 63 elderly people recover stolen assets and place criminal family members in prison where they could not continue harming vulnerable relatives. The foundation's work had expanded to Colorado and New Mexico, where similar criminal networks had been targeting wealthy elderly people for systematic theft and murder. Harrison had recovered completely from the medication poisoning that Marcus had used to create false symptoms of dementia. His mental clarity and physical health had returned to levels that impressed his doctors and amazed his friends who had watched his apparent decline with sadness and concern. But more importantly, Harrison had found a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life since Samuel's forced departure from their partnership. He spent his days working with foundation investigators, using his knowledge of real estate and business practices to identify suspicious financial transactions that might indicate elder abuse. His network of contacts throughout Phoenix's business community had become an early warning system that helped us intervene before criminal family members could complete their theft of elderly relatives' assets. The most surprising development had been Bradley's transformation during his first months in federal prison. Away from his father's toxic influence and faced with the consequences of his actions, Bradley had begun writing letters to Harrison that expressed genuine remorse for the pain he had caused. The letters revealed that Bradley had been raised to view other people as obstacles to his comfort, but prison had forced him to confront the humanity of the victims he had helped to destroy. Harrison and I decided to respond to Bradley's letters not because we forgave his crimes, but because we believed that redemption was possible for people who genuinely acknowledged their mistakes and committed to making amends. Bradley would spend the rest of his life in prison, but his cooperation with federal investigators had helped prosecute 12 other members of the elder abuse network who might otherwise have escaped justice. Marcus, however, had shown no remorse for his actions and continued to blame everyone except himself for his situation. His letters to Harrison contained demands for legal appeals and accusations that federal agents had violated his constitutional rights during the investigation. Marcus apparently remained convinced that his wealth and social connections would eventually secure his release from prison, despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt and the life sentence that made parole impossible. The ripple effects of our case had extended far beyond Arizona's borders. Federal investigators had used our evidence to identify and prosecute similar elder abuse networks in 12 states, resulting in 437 arrests and the recovery of $896 million in stolen assets. The case had become a model for how law enforcement agencies could work with community organizations to protect vulnerable populations from organized criminal activity. But the personal impact on my own life had been equally transformative. Owning the Meridian Tower had given me financial security that allowed me to complete my graduate degree in social work and pursue a career focused on protecting vulnerable populations. The building's income provided the foundation's operating budget, creating a sustainable funding source that would continue Harrison's work long after he was no longer able to participate directly. I had also discovered that my grandfather's story was not unique among Mexican-American business owners who had been excluded from opportunities during the 1970s and 80s. The Foundation's research had identified dozens of similar cases where immigrant entrepreneurs had been cheated out of partnerships and property ownership through legal manipulation and social pressure. Some of these cases were recent enough to allow for investigation and potential prosecution, while others served as historical documentation of systematic discrimination that had shaped Phoenix's development patterns. Harrison's commitment to making amends had extended beyond my family's situation to include other business relationships where he had chosen social acceptance over ethical behavior. He had used his knowledge of Phoenix's business history to identify 7 other minority business owners who had been excluded from profitable partnerships during his early career. The foundation was working to provide financial support to their families and to document their contributions to the city's economic development. The work was emotionally challenging because it required confronting decades of injustice that could never be completely repaired. But it was also deeply satisfying because it demonstrated that wealthy white business leaders could choose to acknowledge their past mistakes and take concrete action to address the harm they had caused. Harrison's example had inspired 3 other prominent Phoenix business owners to examine their own histories and consider making similar amends to families they had wronged. As I stood in my office on the 20th floor of the Meridian Tower, looking out at the city that my grandfather had helped to build, but never been allowed to enjoy as an equal partner, I felt a sense of completion that went beyond personal victory. The building that represented my family's stolen dreams had become the foundation for work that would protect other families from experiencing similar betrayals. But more importantly, I had learned that justice sometimes requires patience planning and the willingness to take enormous risks to protect people who cannot protect themselves. My grandfather had been defeated by a system that valued social status over fairness, but his granddaughter had used that same system to create lasting change that would honor his memory and prevent others from suffering the same fate. The phone calls that came to my office each week from elderly people who suspected family members of financial abuse reminded me that our work was far from finished. But each successful case, each criminal prosecution, and each recovered asset proved that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary results when they refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Harrison often reminded me that the most important lesson from our experience was not about defeating criminals, but about the power of choosing to do the right thing, even when it required personal sacrifice and considerable risk. His decision to help me reclaim my grandfather's legacy had cost him his relationship with his son and grandson, but it had also given him a sense of purpose and redemption that money could never have provided. 6 months have passed since Marcus and Bradley began serving their life sentences, and I have had time to reflect on the profound lessons that emerged from our journey through betrayal planning and ultimately justice. The most important realization is that true power does not come from wealth or social status, but from the courage to stand up for what is right, even when the odds seem impossible to overcome. My grandfather Samuel spent 47 years believing that he had been defeated by forces beyond his control, but the truth was more complex and ultimately more hopeful. Yes, he had been betrayed by a business partner who chose social acceptance over loyalty, and yes, he had lost the empire he had worked so hard to build. But his integrity and work ethic had shaped a granddaughter who refused to accept that injustice was permanent or that victims were powerless to fight back against their oppressors. Harrison's transformation from a weak young man who betrayed his partner to an elderly man willing to risk everything to make amends proves that people can change if they have the courage to confront their mistakes and take action to repair the damage they have caused. His decision to fake his own death and work with federal authorities required him to abandon the comfortable life that his wealth had provided, but it also gave him a sense of purpose that had been missing for decades. The Foundation's work has taught me that elder abuse is not an individual problem, but a systematic issue that requires community-wide solutions. Wealthy families use their resources to manipulate legal systems, medical professionals, and social services in ways that make it nearly impossible for isolated elderly victims to protect themselves. But when honest people work together with law enforcement agencies and community organizations, even the most sophisticated criminal networks can be exposed and defeated. Bradley's letters from prison have shown me that redemption is possible even for people who have committed terrible crimes, but only if they genuinely acknowledge the harm they have caused and commit to making whatever amends are possible from their circumstances. His cooperation with federal investigators has helped prosecute dozens of other criminals who might otherwise have continued targeting elderly victims, demonstrating that even people serving life sentences can contribute to justice if they choose to do so. Marcus's continued refusal to accept responsibility for his actions serves as a reminder that some people are so consumed by greed and entitlement that they cannot recognize the humanity of their victims even when faced with the consequences of their cruelty. His inability to feel remorse for murdering elderly people makes him genuinely dangerous, but it also makes his life imprisonment a necessity for protecting vulnerable populations from his continued predation. The financial security that comes from owning the Meridian Tower has given me opportunities that my grandfather never had, but it has also taught me that wealth is only meaningful if it is used to create positive change in the world. The building's income supports the Foundation's work and provides office space for organizations that serve Phoenix's most vulnerable populations, transforming what was once a symbol of exclusion into a center for inclusion and justice. But the most profound lesson has been about the importance of patience and strategic thinking when confronting powerful opponents who have used their resources to corrupt systems that should protect vulnerable people. My initial instinct was to immediately report Marcus and Bradley's criminal activities to local authorities, but Harrison's wisdom helped me understand that rushing into action would have allowed them to escape prosecution and continue harming other elderly victims. The 7 months we spent planning Harrison's fake death and gathering evidence against the entire criminal network felt endless while we were living through them. But that patience ultimately saved dozens of lives and protected hundreds of millions of dollars in assets that would otherwise have been stolen from vulnerable elderly people. Sometimes justice requires the long view and the willingness to sacrifice immediate satisfaction for lasting change. The Foundation's research has revealed that elder abuse cases often involve family members who have been planning their crimes for years, using their intimate knowledge of their victims' finances and social relationships to gradually isolate them from potential sources of help. Fighting back against such sophisticated predators requires similar levels of planning and patience, along with the willingness to take calculated risks that might seem unreasonable to people who have never faced such circumstances. Harrison and I have started speaking at conferences for law enforcement officers, social workers, and community organizers who work with elderly populations. Our presentation focuses on the importance of believing elderly victims when they report suspicious activities by family members, even when those family members appear respectable and have convincing explanations for their behavior. Too often, professionals dismiss elderly people's concerns as paranoia or confusion, allowing criminal family members to continue their theft and abuse until their victims are too damaged to ever recover. The work is emotionally difficult because every successful case reminds us of how many elderly people suffer in silence because they cannot find anyone willing to believe their stories or help them fight back against family members who are stealing their life savings. But each victory also demonstrates that justice is possible when honest people refuse to accept that vulnerable populations must simply endure whatever cruelty their relatives choose to inflict. My relationship with Harrison has evolved into something that feels like the grandfather relationship that my family lost when Samuel was forced out of their partnership. Harrison's mentorship has taught me about business leadership, ethical decision-making, and the importance of using success to create opportunities for people who face systematic barriers to advancement. But more importantly, his example has shown me that it is never too late to choose integrity over convenience, even when that choice requires enormous personal sacrifice. The Foundation's work continues to expand as we identify new cases and develop better methods for investigating and prosecuting elder abuse crimes. We are working with legislators to strengthen laws that protect elderly people from financial exploitation, and to create legal remedies that allow victims to recover stolen assets, even when criminal family members have hidden money in overseas accounts or complex trust structures. But the most satisfying aspect of our work is the opportunity to give elderly people hope when they have been convinced that their situations are hopeless. Every week, we receive calls from people who have been isolated by criminal family members and told that no one will believe their stories or help them fight back. When we can demonstrate that justice is possible and that they are not powerless against their abusers, the transformation is profound and immediately visible. As I sit in my office each morning looking out at the city that my grandfather helped to build, I am reminded that his legacy was not defined by the business partnership he lost, but by the values he instilled in his family and the example he set of working hard and treating people with dignity regardless of their background or circumstances. Those values shaped a granddaughter who refused to accept that injustice was permanent, and they continue to guide the Foundation's work as we fight to protect other families from experiencing similar betrayals. The Samuel Rodriguez Foundation will continue operating long after Harrison and I are no longer able to participate directly in its work. The endowment we have created will fund investigations and prosecutions for decades to come, ensuring that my grandfather's name is associated with justice and protection for vulnerable populations, rather than the betrayal and theft that marked his business career. But the most important legacy of our experience is the proof that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary results when they refuse to accept that powerful criminals are untouchable. Marcus and Bradley believed that their wealth and social connections made them immune to consequences, but they discovered that patience, planning, and moral courage are more powerful than money and corruption. Every elderly person who calls our foundation for help represents someone who has decided to fight back against family members who view them as obstacles to inheritance rather than human beings deserving of respect and protection. Their willingness to seek help and tell their stories provides us with the evidence we need to identify and prosecute criminal networks that might otherwise continue operating for years. The work is never finished because greed and entitlement continue to motivate people to exploit vulnerable family members, but each successful case makes the next investigation easier and sends a message to potential criminals that elder abuse will not be tolerated in communities where honest people are willing to stand up for justice. What started as a personal mission to reclaim my grandfather's stolen legacy has become a movement that protects thousands of elderly people across multiple states. That transformation proves that individual acts of courage can create ripple effects that extend far beyond their original scope, changing systems and saving lives in ways that the original actors never imagined possible. The lesson I want to leave with anyone who hears this story is that justice sometimes requires extraordinary patience and planning, but it is always worth the effort and risk required to achieve it. Vulnerable people need allies who are willing to believe their stories and fight alongside them against family members who have chosen greed over love. When honest people refuse to accept that injustice is inevitable, remarkable things become possible. I often think about what my grandfather would say if he could see the foundation that bears his name and the building that now serves as a center for protecting vulnerable populations. I believe he would be proud that his granddaughter refused to accept his defeat as permanent, but more importantly, I think he would be satisfied that his values and work ethic had shaped someone who chose to use success for purposes larger than personal enrichment. The story of the Meridian Tower is ultimately a story about the power of choosing justice over convenience, patience over immediate satisfaction, and moral courage over personal safety. Those choices are available to anyone who faces injustice in their own lives, and the results can be more transformative than anyone imagines when they first decide to fight back against powerful opponents who seem untouchable. Harrison often reminds me that the most important question anyone can ask when facing difficult circumstances is not whether they can win, but whether they can live with themselves if they do not try. That question has guided every decision we made during our 7-month journey from discovery to justice, and it continues to guide the Foundation's work as we fight to protect elderly people from family members who view them as sources of money rather than human beings deserving of love and respect. The phone in my office will ring again tomorrow with another call from an elderly person who needs help fighting back against criminal family members, and the Samuel Rodriguez Foundation will be ready to provide that help with the same patience, planning, and moral courage that made our own victory possible. That is the true legacy of everything we have accomplished, and the most meaningful way to honor my grandfather's memory. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between doing what was easy and doing what was right, even when the right choice seemed impossible or dangerous? I would love to hear your thoughts about standing up for justice when the odds seem overwhelming. Please share your story in the comments below. And if this video inspired you to think differently about fighting back against injustice, please like this video to help it reach others who might need to hear this message. Do not forget to subscribe to my channel for more stories about ordinary people who refuse to accept that powerful criminals were untouchable, and please share this video with anyone who might be facing similar challenges in their own lives. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is remind each other that justice is possible when honest people refuse to give up even when the fight seems hopeless. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it encourages you to believe that remarkable things become possible when we choose courage over comfort and justice over convenience. Remember that every act of standing up for what is right creates ripple effects that can change systems and save lives in ways we never imagine when we first decide to fight back.